Okay, folks, I'm back. All right. Tonight we're going to keep it fairly brief. Things are getting very busy around here, Passover and various other things. But we will keep it brief, and then I don't think there'll be a class next week or the week after for a few weeks now because of Passover. Okay. One of the things that I wanted to mention, a very important idea. In this week's Torah reading, as you know, every week we read a certain section from the Torah, and this week's Torah reading is called Tazria. And it starts off talking about when a woman becomes pregnant and so on and so forth. But later on, towards the end of the section, it talks about someone who becomes a leper. Now, leprosy as an illness was, I guess, fairly common in the ancient world. But here, essentially, we're not talking about leprosy as some kind of communicable disease per se. In other words, we're not talking about the disease of something that affected the skin and caused the person eventually to basically waste away. The traditional leprosy, which has more or less been wiped out in certainly in the West, not in Africa, but in the West. But what we are talking about, at least according to the sages and according particularly to Kabbalah, the Arizal, the Zohar, is leprosy as a spiritual disease. Leprosy is a spiritual disease which is caused by a number of different factors, one of which is speaking badly about other people, speaking ill of other people, which is called in Hebrew, it's called Lashon Hara, literally the evil tongue. But what it means is picking out the bad in other people and emphasizing it and so on and so forth. Now, just to be sure and to clarify, we're not saying that you have to put on blinders and not notice when things are wrong. And sometimes you have to speak out when things are wrong, when other people are doing something wrong. But one has to be very, very careful that this should be something between you and the person in whom you see the wrong. Or at least, if that's not possible to tell that person what you see wrong, then at least someone who loves them and who will try and rectify them and help them to tell them. In other words, leprosy here is seen in Kabbalah in particular, the sages in general, Kabbalah in particular, as a problem with seeing bad in other people and publicizing it, publicizing the evil in other people. Seeing it is one problem, publicizing it is a completely different problem. And that's what leads to the idea of leprosy. So therefore, one of the cures, or part of the cure, not one of the cures, part of the cure for leprosy is that the person has to be isolated. The leper has to be isolated. He's not allowed to be in a community. He's not allowed to communicate with people. And the purpose of that, although he can communicate with other lepers, but the purpose of that is to get him to think, him or her, to think very carefully about how it is that they've been communicating in the first place. And one of the things that he has to do, the leper has to do, he or she, is if they see another person coming, they have to call out, Tome, Tome. I am impure, I am impure. So there's two things over here. First of all, there's the recognition of one's own impurity. And I'll speak about that a little bit more in a second. The second thing is that one has to communicate the fact that one knows that one is impure to other people. Tame, Tame Yikra, he has to call out, she has to call out and say, I am impure. Other people should know. Now, let's just understand this state of impurity that we're talking about here, the spiritual state of impurity. It's explained that essentially every person that's alive in this world has two things that are keeping that person alive. Or it's really, you could say, two aspects of one thing, two aspects of the soul. One aspect is the outer aspect, which keeps the body alive. In other words, the level of nefesh, as it's called. And then you have what's called the level of neshama. Neshama meaning, that's really the concept of soul. There's the life force of the body, which also comes from the soul, and then there's the life force of the soul itself. There's the soul itself. Now, when the body is affected by leprosy, then a person is considered to be, in a sense, physically, basically dead. Basically dead, not quite, but basically. But even more so, the inner core, the inner godly core of that person is no longer within the person. It only hovers above him on the outside, so to speak, above him or her. In other words, that the essential divine spark, which is the soul, is no longer invested in the person. And that is why this person is experiencing this horrible disease. So the Baal Shem Tov comes along and he says that this calling out, the person acknowledging first of all his own faults and foibles, Tameh Tameh Yikra, he calls out, I am impure, I am impure. To recognize his impurity is part of his cure. But the second thing is to communicate that, the fact that he recognizes this impurity. Now, what's the point of the communication? This is what the Baal Shem Tov says. Very interesting. He says that the point of communicating this idea of one's impurities is not to embarrass the person, to embarrass the leper, or make them feel bad about themselves. The intention is to seek compassion from other people, that they will pray for that person. Either they'll pray or they'll, in some way or another, help. So the Baal Shem Tov's idea is that this Tameh Tameh Yikra, he calls that I am impure, means I am impure, I need help. So from here, we see two profoundly important ideas when it comes to a person having spiritual ills, let's call them. One spiritual ill, for example, would be depression, thoughts of suicide, things like that. Depression is a spiritual ill in which the cure is, first of all, to recognize, part of the cure is to recognize that I'm sitting in darkness, right? There's darkness inside. And there ought to be light. Let's use the expression, an enlightened person. An enlightened person, the word enlightened really, I think it's really based on a verse. The verse says that the wisdom of a person lights up his face. So to be enlightened means to have that wisdom, that inner wisdom, illuminating a person from the inside. That's what enlightenment is, being illuminated from the inside by wisdom and other things. So when a person finds himself, let's say, in depression or in some other spiritual malady, it could be depression, it could be suicidal, a person might be suicidal, it could be that a person is, let's say, addicted to various things, it could be that a person has a problem controlling certain emotions like anger. All of these things, which are called nig'ei b'nei adam, the plagues of human beings, or the plagues that affect human beings. And we're not talking about frogs and lice and the plague of darkness. And we're talking about inner darkness. We're talking about that darkness in one's soul, right? The darkness of one's soul. So when a person acknowledges, the first step is to acknowledge that I have a problem. I'm a depressive. I'm a cruel person. I'm a liar. I'm an angry person. I'm an addicted person, and so on. So the first thing is acknowledgement. You got to acknowledge the facts, and the facts don't. It's hard to acknowledge the facts. It's not an easy thing. Dealing with let's say addictions. It's a very difficult person. When a person is addicted, there is a constant attempt to hide from the truth. And the only way to overcome it is to acknowledge, tome, right? I'm spiritually afflicted. I'm impure. I'm spiritually impure. But not with the result, therefore, that there's nothing that can be done. The first step in the Tikkun is to acknowledge that there's a problem. The second thing is to seek help and guidance. Very, very important that very often alcoholics, for example, I've studied a lot with alcoholics and drug addicts and things like that. And they all say the same thing, that getting over it on your own, white knuckling it, getting through it on your own is very, very difficult. You have to have what they call a sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous, I believe. It's called a sponsor. You have to have someone else who has basically been through your problems and has managed to come out the other side, and now knows what to do, and knows the how shall we say, the devious nature of one's self-justification, the devious nature of one's insistence that there's nothing wrong. I can control this if I want to. I'm just enjoying the drug or the alcohol or whatever it may happen to be, sex addiction, things like that. Actually, the latter is one of the most difficult problems to deal with. Sorry, just let me switch that phone off. Sorry about that. All right, I'm just going to switch this. There we go. Okay. Okay. So, the second thing, therefore, is that one has to reach out to someone who cares about you, a friend or a sponsor, or a spiritual guide, a rabbi or a priest or whatever, imam, whatever your particular persuasion is, and seek guidance from that person. Of course, seeking guidance means being willing to listen and being willing to do it, being willing to make changes. But of course, you have to be sure that it's the right person. It's not always easy to find the right kind of spiritual guide. So the idea, therefore, is that the inner impurity, the inner darkness, which is called the spiritual leprosy, if you would like to say it like that, or the Kabbalistic leprosy, is a state of inner darkness in which the first step is to recognize the darkness, and the second step is to ask someone else to help you get out of it. Even if that other person hasn't gotten out of it themselves yet, they might still be in it, but if you could both have good intentions and the right intentions to get out, then even such a person can be of aid in one's journey. But the second step is sometimes very difficult for a lot of people. They don't want to acknowledge it. They are willing to acknowledge it to themselves, but they're not willing to acknowledge it to another person. And that is the critical step that needs to be done, that we learned out from this week's Torah reading. Tome, Tome Yikra. You have to call out. You have to tell them, I'm Tome. Now, of course, when you go to your spiritual mentor or whatever, you don't start off the words, I'm spiritually impure. You start to explain the situation and so on and so forth. Hopefully that person will then understand and make the right moves to help you out of your situation. So that is all that I have to say tonight. As I said, it's going to be very short tonight. I got just too much to do. And the sound is diminished at your end. I'm sorry. When I moved, I think I turned the mic in the opposite direction. So just to recap the last thing that I said. Okay. The last thing that I said, that don't be, don't try and do it on your own. You must have a partner or a sponsor or a leader or a guide or a whatever. And this doesn't only apply to people who have serious spiritual defects of the types that we mentioned, but even someone who wants to move on and up should speak out their needs and their desires and so on and so forth, and their plans. Discuss it with someone who can lend a hand and lend a perspective that can make things more practical and clarify issues that you might only be seeing, that you for sure are only seeing from your point of view. Okay, folks, I'm sorry that I have to run, but next couple of weeks we will be out of it, and then we will get back together again after that. All right, good night, and for all of my Jewish friends, have a wonderful Passover. All the best.